Hey, like you need John?
No, I'm taking Taylor's.
Yeah, you had a brief stint.
What'd you guys do?
Yeah.
He's in Chicago. Him and Borg.
That's crazy.
Oh, really?
Do we have agendas, Mike?
You know, I don't think we printed agendas out on the bottom.
Probably some-
Feels like this.
You want copies?
Do you have some? Will you give?
I'm not sure.
We'll go run some copies.
That'd be great.
But after introductions, it's me.
Going to be on the.
All right.
Pardon?
It's going to be on the population forecast.
I don't know who's on the phone. We're recording.
Prison operations.
All right, we're recording, so I'm gonna get the Public Safety Task Force called to order. Today is October 8th. If we could do quick introductions around the dais.
John Tu, Chief of Police, City of Kaiser.
Jay Dixon, Benton County Commissioner.
Jennifer Williamson, State Representative.
Andy Olson, State Representative.
Jason Myers, Marion County Sheriff.
Steve Berger, representing Oregon Association of Community Corrections Directors.
Steve, you want to introduce yourself?
Steve Dole,
And
Crime Victims United.
Who's on the line, on the phone?
Rick Barron, Circuit Judge, Coos Curry County.
Thank you, Judge. Anyone else? All right, we're having agendas copied right now, but I'm going to turn it over to Mike Schmidt in the CJC to lead us through the first part of this conversation.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Mike Schmidt, Executive Director of the Criminal Justice Commission. I apologize for the last-minute room change, and hopefully we can still maintain what the purpose of that was, which was we had it up in 350 so that instead of having the kind of dais testimony feel to it, we could actually have a more collaborative discussion where even the members of the audience were around the table and we could have that discussion. So hopefully we can still manage that even though we had to be in this room for streaming purposes and audio and visual. So with that, I'll get started. And the first part on the agenda is to talk to you all about the October 1 forecast that was recently released. And some of you are members of the Prison Forecast Committee, so this won't be news to you. But others of you, maybe this is the first time you've seen it. So I'll walk through the forecast, try to explain kind of what the Office of Economic Analysis described and the reasons why we're seeing the things we're seeing. Feel free to stop me and ask questions. But hopefully I put some slides together that will hopefully make it a little bit more clear why we're seeing the jump that we're seeing in the near term. And if you're following along online, I'll do my best or on the phone, I'll do my best to tell you when I advance slides. So the very first slide is a slide that you're all very familiar with. It's the prison population and forecast slide. And this is the overall population. So this includes women, this includes men, this is the whole thing. When we get to the end of the presentation, I'll go the women's population and then the men's population, so I'll break it out. But this is the overall slide. And so we have our two lines on there that talk about when we hit these lines, we need to open up Deer Ridge and OSP minimum, and then also Junction City. And you'll recall from this presentation over many times that the green line is the pre-3194 forecast. So this is if we had done nothing in 2013, this is where we were projected to go. The black line that I just put up there is what we've actually done. So since 2013, this is what the prison population has actually done. And you can see that we have not crossed that Deer Ridge and OSP minimum line. The orange line that I just added up there was the April forecast that came out during the legislative session. So this is the forecast that DOC was budgeted on, that all that was figured out, and we were projected, as you can see, to have a dip right about now that we'd be going into, and that we still would be below that dotted line. And then the October 1 forecast is the light blue line. So unlike previously where we weren't going to even cross the Deer Ridge line until 2019, the October forecast has us crossing that by March of next year. So I'm going to try to unpack this a little bit and give you the reasons why, and the Economic Analysis Office, what they have said, why this is. And then at the very end, we'll break it out by males and females. So the major bullet points that was released in the October 1 forecast for why we're seeing that big jump that we weren't previously slated to see is really kind of two major points. One is the diminishing impacts from 3194. These are sentence changes that went into effect in July of 2013, and you're going to see that, and we got some slides to show this, that you get those effects kind of right away, but over a longer period of time, those sentencing changes become the new normal, right? That becomes how everybody's been sentenced. You don't see the drop. And I got a slide that kind of breaks that out a little bit more. So one is the diminishing impacts from 3194, the sentencing changes. And the other is the slight changes in the release profile of inmates that we're seeing. And this manifests itself in two ways. One, a slightly longer average length of stay in both not only the property and drug crimes, but also in the person crimes. Across the board, we're seeing just a slight uptick in the average length of stay. And then the other part of this is fewer releases, fewer people who are getting sent to prison with a 0 to 12-month prison sentence. Before, we used to see more of those, and if you think about it, it makes intuitive sense, because these are probably people that counties are looking at as good candidates for diversionary programs in their counties. But the fact remains we're seeing less of them come to prison in this smaller sentence range. So to kind of visually unpack those things.
Mike, I'm sorry for interrupting, but I've got obviously I've been laboring under a misunderstanding of the sentencing system from what you just said. I thought that as a result of, and I should know it, but the bill number is escaping me. Pardon me?
1145.
Thank you. I thought that as a result of 1145, we didn't send people to prison that had 13 months or under to serve.
And that's correct. In terms of a sentence that you get in the courtroom, you could find yourself, let's say you got a 13-month prison sentence, but you spent a couple months in the county before up to sentencing, so you have credit for time served, earned time. So when I say 0 to 12-month sentences, I'm talking about actual time spent in the institution. So your sentence length would actually be longer than the 12 months, but the time you spend in the institution, we saw a number of people that would serve in that 0 to 12-month range for either credit for time served reasons or other earned time credits. They would physically only spend 0 to 12 months. So there are a small amount of people that do that just because of that situation. But you're right. As far as getting a sentence goes, you have to be more than 12 months to go to a DOC institution.
Thank you for clarifying that.
And if I can just say, Judge, if you're on the phone, if you could mute yourself, we're getting a little feedback.
Okay?
Thank you,
I will
sir.
mute myself. I've been asked to do that before.
Thank you.
So if you're following along, we are on the slide now that says, it's titled Prison Intakes Average Length of Stay, and shows some light blue bars. And what we're trying to represent here is exactly what we talked about in that previous slide that said the average length of stay is slightly drifting upwards. And so what Kelly's broken down on this slide is just a quarterly look at every single sentence in prison. So this is not just property or drugs, this is everything. But it gives the total average length of stay. And you can see that if we were to draw a line so you could tell what the slope was, it's a gradual uptick quarter by quarter that we're seeing. So that's one thing that the Office of Economic Analysis pointed to say this is a reason why our prison population is higher than what we thought. We weren't forecasting these slightly longer length of stays. Moving on to the next slide, titled Prison Intakes. This kind of gets at that 0 to 12 month point that OEA was making. And what they're saying is that of all the intakes, we would see, and this, again, Kelly broke it out kind of quarterly, we would see this many in the light blue boxes of that 0 to 12 month length of stay. And you can see as we have advanced from 2013 to where we are at present, that light blue bar keeps shrinking more and more. So of those shorter sentences, less and less of them are being sent to prison. while the overall intake numbers is staying pretty much about the same. So that's what OEA was trying to get at with that. Our release profiles are shifting. There's a slight shift, which in turn explains why we're seeing some of the increase that we're seeing. The other thing that they talk about is the kind of phasing in of the sentencing changes in 3194. And what this slide does, these are just, and it says at the top, HB 3194, total estimated bed savings. Every time the OEA gets together to do and forecast the prison, they say, okay, what do we think is going to be the impact from the 3194 sentencing changes? And they do it by crime. And the next slide breaks it out by ID theft and Rob 3 and marijuana and driving while suspended and short-term trans leave. What this slide represents is if you look at the very top left corner, it says July 1, 2013, right? That's right when the legislation went into effect. And immediately, people on that day started getting sentenced under the new regime. So immediately you saw an impact because the day before they would have gotten 24 months, the day after they'd get 18 months, for example. And so immediately you see an impact in our prison population in number of days and beds saved. When OEA says that the 3194 sentencing changes are phasing out, or the way I phrased it, becoming the new normal, that's what this graph represents. The black vertical line there is where we are today. And you can see that the relative impact that we expect to see from where we are today going forward is much, much smaller than what the impact was up until this point. And so we break that out by crime so you can see visually how each of these sentencing changes has phased in. So for robbery 3, you can see it took a little while before we saw it, which, because you'll recall, robbery 3 was not a diversion change, it was a sentence length reduction, right? So you still need to serve the first part of your sentence before we would see any impact in you having a shorter sentence. So that one took a little while to phase in, and at this point, we are pretty much saying that we don't anticipate seeing any additional bed savings from that sentencing change. Driving while suspended. Same sort of story, although driving while suspended, the reason it jumps down immediately is it was an intake difference. There were less circumstances where you would automatically go to prison for driving while suspended. So we immediately saw some people that were not intakes that would have been. Identity theft. Identity theft, very similar to Rob 3 in that you have to serve a sentence before you would see any impact in the sentence length change. And we still are anticipating a slight impact based on what we have here, but it really is pretty much leveled off. The drug Measure 57 changes. This was an intake change where judges did not have to send you to prison. It became a situation where even if you had a prior, they could make that decision. So we saw some intake increases, but we're not anticipating much more bed savings from the Measure 57 drug changes. Marijuana is more complicated, obviously, because of other factors that are outside of 3194, but we're not anticipating getting any more savings because now with marijuana being legalized, pretty much you're not going to prison, and we weren't going to use that anyway. And then short-term trans leave is the last one. And even short-term trans leave, which as this kind of graphically shows you had the biggest bed savings, up to this point, the relative savings that we're looking at increasing our beds by is in a 30 to 40 additional beds that we'll see phased out over a long period of time. So short-term trans leave cannot continue to drive any decreases the way it is. So those were the OEA reasons. I wanted to kind of focus you on what we've seen with 3194 and how the changes have gone in a statewide basis. So statewide prison usage, looking at the 57 property and drug offenses, this is just adding them all up and looking at prison intakes. So it's a slide titled Prison Intakes for Property and Drug Prison. And what you can see is the blue bar is July 2012 to 2013, and then the orange bar, July 2013 to 14, and the gray bar is the most recent. And you can kind of see the areas where 3194 is targeting, those Measure 57 property and drug crimes. The very first 3 bars are prison intakes. Those are straight from the courtroom, first sentence prison intakes. And you can see that every year, straight from the courtroom, less people are getting sent straight to prison. Presumably because there are now programs in counties that are being built up where counties have decided that they can manage the person safely with public safety in mind and keep them locally, which feeds into the next set of 3 bars you see, which is revocations. So more people being put on probation, naturally, you would expect there's probably going to be some more people that are not successful on supervision and end up being revoked. So it's kind of operating the way that we would anticipate as the counties continue to build up programs. The thing is, though, doing some quick math, if you added the probation revocations to the first sentences, it's pretty much flat, right? So no real change. It's almost offsetting itself perfectly between first sentences and revocations. And then Kelly breaks out the exact same thing for the drugs, and you can see that it's a pretty similar phenomenon. First sentences from the courtroom have been going down, revocations, and for drugs, revocations are a lot flatter than the property crimes. We do the same thing for average length of stay and compare the 3 years of 3194 sentencing changes being in effect. And you can see that with average length of stay, first sentences for the property, the first set of 6, the property crimes, pretty flat, from 24.7 to an increase to 25.6 and 25.3. We're all within a half a month of each other, while at the same time the average length of stay for revocations is increasing. In drugs is a little bit different, the Measure 57 drugs, because when we really looked at this, what we found is that those less serious drug crimes are being diverted, but we're having actually more serious of those super substantial quality crimes coming through our system that we weren't seeing before. So this is a little bit misleading on this part of it because we do believe 3194 is having the impacts we thought it would. It's just being overtaken by the fact that there are more bigger cases than there were in 2013. And then total prison months. And so if you just add everything up, revocations, intakes, length of stay, and you smash it all into one slide to look at how many total prison months are we using, and it pretty much tells the same story as the parts. We've had a decrease in first sentence prison months used, but an increase in revocation prison months used. So it's kind of offsetting itself almost perfectly, which is why the 3194 crimes, they phased in and they've been pretty flat, the sentencing changes in terms of bed savings. So the last slide before we go into the male and female graph, the forecast graphs, is just, and it's too small to see probably all the counties, but we go county by county and we looked at each county's 3-year average prison usage for property and drug crimes, and we just added it all up. How much prison did you use as a county, and then divide that number by 3 to get your 3-year average. And then we took the last year, the 14 to 15 year, and to see how counties would stack up against their, what we're calling baseline 3 years. And so that's what this chart does. It shows you county by county how each county stacked up in the last year of justice reinvestment versus their 3-year average. The green bar means that you used less than your 3-year average, less prison on property and drug crimes. Yellow means 0 to 10% increase above your 3-year baseline average. And red means you used more than 10% of an increase than you had in the prior 3-year baseline. So this is 2 years into 3194. The sentencing changes are in. Counties got grants, got some programming, got some funding, and still a majority of the counties, albeit a lot of the smaller counties, were using increasing amounts of prison in this population with a couple of very big offsets, most notably Multnomah County. Really used a lot less prison in this specific population than they had against their 3-year baseline. To the point where if you compare Multnomah County to some of the other peer counties, Marion and Lane most notably, although Multnomah County is much more populous, they're still using less prison in whole terms. So now I want to break out, yeah.
The issue of large drug prosecutions. Again, I was under the impression that generally when you had these larger drug crimes that involved trafficking, et cetera, that these went to the federal government. That's not the case, or?
I think it's kind of a county by county situation, and discussing it with the federal government in terms of what cases they'll take. From my experience being in the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office, frequently they would be intercepted by local law enforcement, and they would call in the federal government either to aid in the investigation, but then to see if they would take over the case. It's our understanding from talking to prosecutors that the federal government has been less willing to take as many cases as they used to.
So there's no guideline. There's no there was X amount of grams or pounds or whatever, or it was this type, or it's just kind of a willy-nilly thing. We'll take it. Maybe we'll look at this one. Maybe we won't. This one looks high profile. This one doesn't. I mean, what is there any guidelines on this?
I'd have to turn that over to a DA. I never worked in the drug crime, so I'm not sure if there are specific standards or guidelines and whether they have changed.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, Mike, I think that they still have the thresholds, but they're just doing case by case now. That's what they're doing.
Yeah. So if you're on the phone, I'm now going to prison population and forecast by gender, and we'll start with the good news, as it were. Female prison population and forecast. This is a short-term look. The next slide takes it out to the long term. And again, we have the OSP minimum line, and this is something you're probably all familiar with. Once the population goes past this line, Department of Corrections has said that they would need to open up OSP minimum to accommodate the female population. Pre-3194, we were supposed to hit that mark back in 2013. Post-3194, how we've actually performed is represented by this black line. And you can see that we did briefly cross that line in the beginning of 15, end of 14. We've since dipped back down. The April forecast had us kind of skirting below that line for the foreseeable, I think, until 2019. The October forecast has us jumping above it briefly. Unlike in the male population, I think scale is very important here because we're talking about going above that line by about 10 to 15 beds, although it looks, just by looking at the line graph, like it really jumps up. So keeping that in mind. But the good news is if we go out farther to the longer look, the latest forecast, once we do that slight jump above the line, we come back down and we actually stay below where we were projected to be in April. So this also doesn't take into account the forecasting committee did not incorporate House Bill 3503 to try to estimate, because that's a pilot project in just 5 counties, and it would have been too hard to estimate what kind of an impact that would be. It still remains to be seen what kind of an impact that would be on this population. So that's not in here as well. And then to the male prison population and forecasts. And again, the short-term look. The dotted line is where we have said all along Deer Ridge would need to be open. The bold red line at top is Junction City. There's a 3194 if we had done nothing forecast. The black line is where we have been. Orange is where in April we were supposed to go. And the blue line is the October forecast. So this forecast now has us crossing that threshold by about March 1st of next year, is where if we stick straight on to this forecast, we will be in a position where DOC is going to have to figure out how to manage the increase in beds outside of existing capacity. And to take that to the long term, same thing, just looking out a longer ways. There's where the orange line had us not crossing the Deer Ridge line until 2019. And here's where the October 1 forecast has us now. Crossing it, like I said, in March of next year, and then staying above it pretty much past that. So that's the October 1 forecast. I can answer any questions about that. Hopefully that kind of clears up why the Office of Economic Analysis is predicting that there's been a 150 bed change that there wasn't in the previous forecast.
So does the forecast consider the reinvestment dollars in those programs?
Good question. It does not. It does not. We have no good way of predicting how each county is going to implement programs, what types of programs, and how that will change their local practices. Multnomah County, we've got some good data because they've been doing it for at least a year now, if not a little bit more. But for other counties, they're starting just now to bring some of those programs online. So we couldn't forecast for that, how those grants would impact it.
So another question then. So I guess the reason that matters is because DOC has to plan ahead, right?
That's right. That's right. And so we really, in terms of when DOC has to make decisions, and I know Director Peters is next on the agenda and will come up and address the committee about this, but yeah, they have to plan statutorily based on this latest forecast. So they have to make decisions based on the best information they have.
So the forecast also does not include the family sentencing pilot programs. I think there's 5 of them that will be starting fairly soon, so it doesn't include that. As well as there's a number of counties that are looking at prison diversion programs that will be coming online very shortly. Doesn't include that as well, right?
That's correct.
Other questions? All right. Thank you very much, Mike.
If it's okay with you, Madam Chair, I'll stay up here as other people in case I'm needed.
Let Director Peters come on down.
Good afternoon. Are you ready for me to begin?
Yes.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
So as Director Schmidt just explained, the October forecast really did take us by a bit of surprise. We walked into that forecast room, and I sit on the advisory committee, and we were curious as to what was going to be happening with the female population. I wasn't even prepared to ask about the male population. So if we back up and look at the April forecast, at that time, just 6 months ago, the male population would not have triggered the activation of the Deer Ridge facility until July of 2019.
Director, hold on one second.
So as Director...
Everybody on the phone, if you could mute, we're getting feedback on the mics. Thanks.
So as Director Schmidt pointed out, that trigger point for Deer Ridge is 13,490 male inmates. So today, as he pointed out, we're looking at a forecast that moves that trigger point up to March 2016. So as in response, as the chief pointed out, we needed to figure out what we were doing operationally. So we put together a proposal that we're going to propose to the legislature and to the governor's office that will help us accommodate that male population. But before I get to that proposal, and so many of you in your last round of questions to Director Schmidt were getting to this, I think it's so important to note again and again that 3194 is working. This forecast shouldn't sound alarms that 3194 isn't working, and based on the questions you just asked, there's even more to be seen based on the program dollars and the diversion programs and the parenting diversion proposals that are out there. So I think that's really important. And we know it's working because if you'll remember back in 2012, pre-3194, I was getting ready to ask for funding to open the Deer Ridge medium facility and have that entire campus filled, and we would be breaking ground on a new facility in Junction City right now. So I think it's important to know that we have come a long way. The slides that you pointed out clearly say that, but I wanted to really reiterate that as we move forward. So to get to the proposal, what I asked my folks on the ground was operationally, please come up with a plan that allows us to run safe and secure prisons and allows us to negatively impact the JRI dollars in the least. And so the proposal we plan on submitting would actually not open a new prison, so I think that's very important to note, but it would shift a population. So we opened the Madras facility, the Deer Ridge Correctional Institution in Madras, back in 2007. On that campus, it has 2 facilities. It has a minimum custody facility and then a medium custody facility. And what we are proposing is the current minimum facility has 657 built capacity, and that includes 13 segregation beds. We also have 130 temporary and emergency beds in that facility right now. So that's over 19%, almost 20%. It's 19.8% over the built capacity, and I'll talk about our temporary and emergency bed situation here in just a minute. But what we're recommending is that we take those now 787 inmates that are on the minimum side of the facility and literally march them across the parking lot into the medium facility, pillaging from the minimum facility desks, chairs, phones, moving the staff, keeping the minimum open for some programming space, keeping the correctional industries program still going on the minimum, but we would no longer have inmates sleeping in that minimum facility. And by making that shift happen, only opening 8 of the 10 units in that medium facility and operating what was constructed as a medium as a minimum. So we would only place minimum custody inmates there, which allows us to staff it at a lower level. That shift would cost about $9.5 million. We would have to hire some additional staff in order to accommodate for programming and medical services, et cetera. But compared to $42 million of what it was going to cost to open Deer Ridge Medium and operate both the minimum and the medium. So as I mentioned earlier, we have been managing our population with a significant number of temporary and emergency beds. In fact, today we have 988 temporary and emergency beds across the state. That's 24 more than I promised the legislative body we would utilize, that I promised our unions we would utilize. And we are doing that because the April forecast predicted a dip. We were going to get up to that cap and need all of those temporary and emergency beds, but the forecast in April predicted a relief. Essentially, that relief has gone away. And so shifting this population then would not take off any temporary and emergency beds. I want to be very clear. It would just simply adjust then for the projected growth based on the April forecast. The other thing that the October forecast does is it takes the Junction City facility and moves it back in the 10-year window. So 3194 moved it out, and this latest forecast moves it back in. It says we need it by 2024, so it's barely inside the 10-year window. It's 9 years out, but it's inside the window. And I mention that because I think given the points that you all just made around JRI not being fully implemented, programs that are being rolled out today where we haven't seen the positive impact of those, that doesn't have to be our fate. And so I'm telling people we need to talk about Junction City, but I don't want it to alarm the public safety system. I really want it to inspire us to roll up our sleeves and really roll out these justice reinvestment dollars, because I think as a system we have the ability to push that back outside of the 10-year window. On one final note, I'll end with the good news that Director Schmidt pointed out just minutes ago, in that the October forecast is relatively unchanged for the female population. So we will be able to continue to operate the female population until May of 2019 at Coffee Creek Correctional Facility. So we will continue to monitor the actual prison population, and we will keep everyone updated on the daily count and what the actual numbers look like. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Yeah, I might have missed it, but how much more capacity does opening the medium give you over the minimum at Deer Ridge?
So just by opening units 1 through 8, leaving 9 and 10 still closed, we'd have 200 additional beds.
And that 9 million is, that's one-year cost or
Biennial.
biennial?
And so the longer we're able to kind of roll that out slowly, the less of the 9.5 million we'll be spending.
And then how much?
In
lead-
this biennium, excuse me, Chief.
So I realize it brings Junction City inside by 1 year. How much lead time do you need to get Junction City towards breaking ground?
Chief, Madam Chair, thank you for asking, because that's really important. It's 5 years, which means if it stays in the projections for 2024, in the next budget cycle, I will have to be talking about Junction City, that's what makes this so imperative. Thank you.
Madam Chair? Paulette, give me a picture of Deer Ridge. How many beds are in the minimum right now? Total beds available?
We have 787, that includes 13 segregation beds and 130 temporary and emergency beds.
And what's the total in the medium?
The total in the medium will be 987 once we open 1 through 8, and an additional 129 when you open units 9 and 10.
So, okay, so 9 and 10 gives you again how much?
Another 129.
129. So the total capacity of that prison is what then? I haven't got it. I can't do this in my head.
Almost about 1,800 on the entire campus.
One other question. Do you happen to have this information? I wouldn't expect you to, but as long as we're talking about growth of use of prisons, do we happen to know what the population of Oregon is going to look like in 2024?
Mr. Dolan, Madam Chair, I do not have that number memorized.
Okay, so we don't know what the growth is going to be between now and 2024. Okay.
I believe the Office of Economic Analysis has that forecasted, but I don't have that number here, but we can figure it out.
All right.
I get one question, Madam
Go
Chair.
ahead.
So, as I recall, I'm on the Population Forecast Committee, we talked about the segregation beds, and that utilization is down, correct?
Sheriff, Madam Chair, that's correct, and we're proud of that. We've had lots of internal discussions inside the organization to optimize our use of segregation. We've made some programmatic changes that actually have now left our prisons safer than they were before, thus not needing as many segregation beds. The interesting point, and I know why you're asking this question, and I appreciate it, is that's left a compounding issue inside our prisons. So when you're utilizing fewer segregation beds, now I have more stress on the general population requiring those temporary and emergency beds. And those of you that run correctional facilities know that you have temporary and emergency beds for a very important reason, for when you have a fire or a flood. And we are utilizing all of ours simply for population management. Thanks, Sheriff.
Hey, Steve, looking quickly at the state's number, 2022, the estimate is 4.3 million.
In 22?
Yeah.
And we're now about 3.7
We're right about 4.
right now?
If I'm reading the right column, which I think I am.
So I have a comment and a question. The comment is for clarity, and the question may be premature. So the comment is, so the easiest thing to do is to take $9.5 million out of JRI investment funds. But we do that. We cut off our nose to spite our face by doing that. I mean, obviously. Am I right in that? Right?
You are right. We will be talking about that in short order.
Today?
Mhm.
Okay, I'll save my question.
That's Public Safety Task Force, next steps.
Thank you.
But I would tell you, Chief and Madam Chair, that we recognize that resources are limited, and that's why we wanted to come up with the most minimal proposal possible. We are, and always have been, huge supporters of justice reinvestment, and we would certainly want to support those efforts. We've believed in them from the minute I was a commissioner on the Public Safety Commission, and really hope that we're able to see the full implementation of JRI. We recognize we're walking into a very difficult revenue situation.
Yeah.
Questions?
If I can make a comment, going back to a question I asked of Mike earlier around this issue of drugs and drug prosecutions and Fed versus state. You know, for anybody that's been paying attention to it, and I'm sure everybody in this room has been, there's about 6,000 people who are going to be released from the federal prison system very soon. And also there's a push on in the, I call it more than a push on in the United States Congress among both parties, or some in both parties, to rearrange the sentencing system and release even more people. And it's certainly questionable about some of those people they're going to be releasing. But all that aside, I'm just making this statement for the record. One more time, I think the good of the order and public safety and protection of innocent victims, potential victims, and people are being, balanced out by politics, and I think we shouldn't lose sight of that. That's the most important reason why we coalesce a government in the first place, is to protect our citizens. And I think those citizens are being used as a football.
So can I comment?
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to get into debate, but as a cop, and being a social and physical conservative, I'm still not a big fan of time as punishment. And as a cop, I'm more interested in preventing crime from happening in the first place than I am in putting people in prison for having committed crimes. And so that's why I'm so interested in JRI.
Anyone else?
Are you,
Oh, yep.
I'm sorry, this is Scott on the phone. I'm having some trouble, so let me know when I can ask the question.
You can ask one right now.
Thank you very much. I was going through security here, so I missed some of the presentation by the director, so maybe you've already answered this. But as we look at what next, are we considering, if we are looking at happening to open beds, are we looking at any adjustments to our current practice that might keep us from doing that? We're having, on the community corrections side, I think we're having fairly big success with the short-term transitional leave. And I just wonder if you've reached that emergency place, if adjusting that to 120 days or something wouldn't affect the population. And maybe you've answered all those questions. I'm sorry if you have.
Hello, Mr. Taylor. Colette Peters here, Madam Chair. We sort of answered it. I'll go back again. I think that what the Department of Corrections is proposing, and I think certainly what the governor's office is hoping that we do, is a really slow approach to this, that we don't spend money unless we absolutely have to, for fear that it doesn't come from the general fund, it comes from justice reinvestment dollars. And so we're wanting to move very cautiously. You may have been moving through security, but the task force mentioned a lot of the programs that are just now getting rolled out, a lot of pilot programs where they have not come to fruition yet. And so the proposal that we're presenting really is a slow one. I would like to very slowly move on the ground, spend a few dollars in the coming months to make sure that everything's plugged in and working in that medium facility that's been there since 2007. So be as fiscally conservative and responsible as possible, and not actually open those beds and hire those additional staff, which is actually what's going to cost the money, until we are confident that those inmates are coming.
Colette, how does all of this impact the investment we made in staff wellness?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that what we've argued all along is these temporary and emergency beds have impacted staff wellness. There's no doubt about it. You've been in our prisons, you know that we have one officer on our units, and we have bunks that are absolutely out of their line of sight. And so certainly that is a stressor. I think our relief factor also is a stressor in terms of mandatory overtime. So it's certainly a compounding issue. There's no doubt about it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Heidi, come on down. We're just building out a panel.
Do you want me to stay just in case?
Probably,
Okay.
yeah. Why not?
Oh, you know I don't need that close to my mouth. Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the task force. Heidi Moad, Governor Kate Brown's Public Safety Policy Advisor. I'm here primarily to just restate, reaffirm the governor's commitment to justice reinvestment. And in fact, she is so committed to justice reinvestment that she had a 2-hour window in November left, and I have booked it for November 10th for her to appear at a summit that we're pulling together pretty quickly and in short order to address the October forecast and the concerns. Obviously, I mean, you guys have already talked about this. If the Department of Corrections ultimately needs north of $9 million to handle this Deer Ridge shift, that is more likely than not going to come out of our Justice Reinvestment Fund. And my concern is that that will end justice reinvestment in Oregon. I don't think the legislator, I mean, it was a hard-fought battle, as you all know, to get our $40 million fund this biennium. Furthermore, if we have to start really seriously considering an investment of over $100 million, hundreds of millions of dollars for Junction City, I mean, the conversation of JRI it's just over for all intents and purposes. You know, I was talking to Director Peters earlier today, and I feel like for the last handful of years, the Department of Corrections has been playing chicken, right? They've been, you know, driving along in the oncoming traffic lane, and now the semi is on the horizon. And we have asked Director Peters and the good people that work for her to just, you know, keep pushing the gas pedal and driving toward that semi truck. And we are now at the point where we are going to have to swerve. And I don't want to swerve, right? I guess I want the semi to take the off ramp if I continue to belabor my analogy here. You know, the way that we can get rid of that semi is for the counties to truly look at using justice reinvestment dollars to do something new, to do something different, and to truly change who we are sending to prison. I can tell you that in addition to the summit that we are planning in November, Mr. Schmidt and I are trying to schedule now with counties that are some of our highest users, a meeting with the county stakeholders, Mr. Schmidt and myself, to really start looking at the numbers and to understand why we are not seeing the savings in those counties that are the you know, biggest users of the beds. I also think that despite perhaps being accused of favoring my home team, I do have to credit Multnomah County for really reducing their prison bed use. And I think it's important that we acknowledge those counties that are really making an effort to bend the curve. And Multnomah County really deserves some credit for that. I hope you heard that, Mr. Taylor, on the phone.
Thank you.
Yeah. I always hate going behind Director Peters because she is always such a voice of optimism and hope, and then I have to come in and be the pessimist, the cynic. But I do, you know, the governor is is asking DOC to continue to sweat bullets here. And that's not a great position for the governor to be in, and it's a horrible position for Director Peters to be in. That having been said, at some point we do have to give relief to the Department of Corrections, and if that means turning the key on Deer Ridge, we'll do it, even though we hate to have to do it. Are there any questions for me?
Well, we don't have to hate to do it if we find the dollar somewhere other than JRI, though, right? Right?
Madam Chair and Chief Teague, that is true. I don't know where we will find those dollars. I mean, let's be realistic about what 2017 session budget looks like.
Yeah.
We've got PERS, we've got Medicaid, we've got potentially a transportation package, and potentially a minimum wage increase. And those are going to be, I believe, priorities of the legislature over finding $9 million in general fund for JRI. And to be just brutally honest, I would be far more inclined to continue to push the rock up the hill to find that $9 million out of general fund if we, in fact, we may have to turn the key and then suddenly we see the savings in JRI. And if that happens, we're going to fight harder to keep JRI than if we continue to not see the savings we need to see.
Yeah.
I think that's right, Heidi. You listed everything on my list of why 2017 will be a brutal budget year. And we said that, those of us in Ways and Means, from day one, that this was going to be the high water mark. And until we see the long-term savings, which presumably is the whole point of all of this, is reducing victimization and seeing long-term savings by putting our dollars and spending them in a different way. We've always known that it would take a while and that we wouldn't see immediate savings, but it would be coming. And having just sat through the grant review committee and read 15 of the county grant applications, there is some amazing stuff in those grants. Some communities are getting together, taking this very seriously, all coming around the table and working together in a way that will address the needs of victims in their county and reduce crime. Others, not as much. It was apparent in grant applications who was taking this work seriously and who wasn't. And what I think may end up happening is that counties that take things seriously will get their grant money, and counties that don't will not. And it's unfortunate because as a legislator and the legislature, we made a promise in 2013 to our local partners that this would be a program that if they got on board and they worked with their communities, that we would be there to fund it. And that was the pushback we got over and over again is, you always say you're going to do this, and then, somehow the money dries up 2-4 years from now, and then you don't, pay for your promises. And so it's very concerning to me that this money would come out of justice reinvestment. As Heidi said, I don't know where else it would come from. It's probably not going to come out of K-12, I can tell you that. So I'm hoping in the conversations that you and Director Schmidt have at the local level that you can help some counties understand where they need to be coming together in maybe a different way, or partnering with other counties, or doing things that will stretch their JRI dollar, so that we can see better, faster results in some of these counties. Because I think that's the thing that will keep the legislature from taking money out of this program, is if they truly believe that the folks who are engaged around the table are doing the hard work and that it is coming. I think if my colleagues don't believe that, that'll be the end of the program.
So is that difference between, it's a lousy way to put this, is that difference between those who take it seriously and those who don't, is that $9 million in there?
I don't know. Mike might know.
So the CJC has $38.7 million from the legislature for just grant purposes. And we are, as Chair Williamson said, we've gone through 15 applications, grant applications. We've approved 15. We have the balance of the 36 counties to go, so 21 left. And we very much want to get that first year money out. And we've had this conversation, Director Peters and I. We want to give the counties a chance to make this work. If we pulled that funding now, if we had to find this money now, as the chair of my commission said, it'd be like selling your battleships to pay for the war right before it starts. If we're going to give this a chance, we need to make that first year investment. So of the 38.7, half of that money will be out of the CJC in the next coming months. Then we go through the end of this fiscal year, and our commission will re-look at how the counties are doing with the Grant Review Committee and seeing of the remaining money, how does that money go back out the door? And if there is $9 million less, that means there'll be approximately $10 million left out of $19 million, rough math, that would be remaining if Director Peters has to make that transition and if the legislature reallocates our grant funds. So then half the money for the second year. So then the choice at that point would be, does everybody's grant go down by a formula, or do we look at the programs that are working and continue investments there and then have to cut the programs that aren't getting a return on investment?
And so much of what we saw in the grant application was buying capacity for programs. So more treatment beds, more domestic violence shelter beds, organizations staffing up to be able to do outreach in a way that they hadn't been able to before, to do reentry in the way they haven't been able to do before. And so, my biggest concern is folks holding back on spending the money because we're having this conversation right now.
Madam Chair, if I could comment, if I could just build off of that, I think that is the challenge, that as we have this conversation will be counties are making their decisions now for next fiscal year, and they're just now going through the building of their contracts and the sustainability of their continuum of services in the community. So, the challenge to us is, as we engage in these conversations, counties are also going to be looking at sustainability and trying to make determinations on how far out, how creative do we get on creating capacity in the community for these offenders, at the risk of potentially having to shut them down. So the risk we take is, as we have these conversations, maybe not going far enough, or not being as creative as we potentially could be, and then not seeing that impact on the beds ultimately.
So I have another question.
No, that's great. We're now moving into next steps conversation, so we're moving along. Unless Heidi has one more thing to say.
Well, Madam Chair, I would just
Because
ask.
you should all stay up here during our next steps conversation, because my guess is we'll have questions.
And I would love to ask my directors to stay here and answer those questions. I have another project that I have to finish up shortly. Thank you very much. Thank you, members of the task force. I am available to any of you if you have any questions for me personally or for the governor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Madam Chair, if I could, there are a lot of people in the room who are working on these things in their counties, and I think could add to this conversation. It was my original intention to have this meeting in a room that would accommodate more of a discussion than testimony. So at this point, opening it up to what those next steps are, it might be appropriate to have people introduce themselves and try to make it more conversational.
That'd be great.
I'm Kelly Officer, Research Analyst at the CJC.
I'm Tim Colahan, Harney County DA, and I also serve on the JRI grant.
I'm Patty Perla, Lake County DA.
I'm Elizabeth Craig with DOC Communications.
Shannon White with Partnership for Safety and Justice.
Ross Caldwell with CJC.
Madeline Dardo, CJC. Betsy Jones, representing Oregon Association of Community Corrections Directors. Laura Smith, also representing the organization.
Chris Foy, Community Corrections Director in Clackamas County, also the LIPSIC Chair in Clackamas County.
Caroline Wong with Multnomah County DA's office.
All right. Go right ahead.
I'm sure I know you've already thought about this, so I'm asking for my own edification, and I'm also betraying my naivete. JRI is good for families. So what is DHS's involvement in this, in their huge budget?
That is a fantastic question. Thus far, the 3509 program or bill that we passed last session to allow 5 counties to create a pilot where they work with community corrections and DHS, where an offender who's a primary parent would be put on the caseload of specialists in both of those agencies that would work together with the parent and the child, particularly for DHS-involved children. But the hope is eventually to have the capacity to have more expertise around stabilizing families as part of the community corrections work that we do. And so I'm anxious to see how that comes out. In Washington, their program has had fantastic results when really the idea is coming in and stabilizing the family as a way to both protect kids and get mom or dad the treatment they need or the mental health treatment they need, whatever it is that's driving that criminal behavior, without with keeping the family together as best we can if it's a safe thing to do. And so they've had great results. I'm hoping our 5 counties will have good results as well. So we're just starting to work with DHS to figure out what that's going to look like. But we've put resources into both agencies, DOC and DHS, to focus on these families and children of incarcerated parents in particular.
Madam Chair, along with that line of conversation, has there been any results from the program that you just talked about in Washington as it has affected recidivism? What's the results from that?
Hey, Madeline, do you know? Our expert on that program is in the back. You want to come on or stand up? Or?
Sure. So, folks that have been in the program have...
Right, yeah, I mean, ultimately, that's what we really want, right, from the program, along with everything else it does, is this program lowering the recidivism rate?
Yeah, it is.
Well,
and I don't know the exact numbers on the top of my head, but they're significantly lower for folks that go through that program.
are these projections or are they actual results?
They're actual.
Can you send that to me, please, or to everybody? I'd like to see that. Okay.
Yeah, so, Madam Chair, I've spoken to the folks from the Department of Corrections in Washington, and they have actually 2 programs, one that's inside the institution and one that's it's a prison diversion program. Both of the cohorts, if you take comparable offenders, they have lower recidivism rates, and the reunification of the family is a lot better as well. So the program's been successful.
Other questions?
I don't have any questions, but well, actually, I kind of do, I think, Madam Chair.
I see your
Thank you.
notes.
Yeah.
Yep.
We're having this discussion today. We've touched on a lot of different things. Where do we go from here? Some proposed ideas that I have, because obviously if we're going to, okay, first, what would be the nicest thing to do, I think, is to allow what's happened with the grants right now to play out, to see how that works out. If that does not work out, then I think we need to have the discussion about, do we add additional time to the transitional leave? And I'm wondering if, Mike, you would, and maybe Kelly, if you could do some numbers along that line, what would that look like if we did? I guess, actually, I'd look at all the way from 30 days to 60 days to even 90 days additional. I mean, that's pretty critical, but I think that that's something we need to really strongly consider thinking about doing, or at least look at, versus losing $9 million from, justice investment. I don't want to do that. And then the other one, I think probably is, and I don't know what that looks like, but the grid, what does that look like if you were to carve 1 month off of that for everything?
So, to the first point, Representative Olson, we can look at the short-term TransLeave projections and see what the impact would be if we extended it by 30, 60, 90 days, and we can report that back to this task force via email. And I don't think that computation would take very long for us to figure out, because we kind of know who's been getting it, and we can get that back to you. As to the second question about the sentencing guidelines grid, a lot of the cases that we're focusing in here are these Measure 57 property and drug crimes. And so Measure 57 really took our property and drugs out of the sentencing guidelines. So I don't know that taking 1 month out of every sentence in the guidelines would make the most sense as far as trying to impact the same people that we're building programs for. So under the idea that counties should consider building up their public safety systems to focus on drug treatment and housing and all those things, it would probably make sense to focus the sentence length change on the same people we're targeting with the resources. And so it would really be looking at Measure 57 in terms of sentence length and what the impact of reducing all of those sentences by 1 month would be, instead of the grid, I think would probably be the better thing to look at. So we can also attempt to take a stab at that.
Okay.
But again, so, one cautionary tale on sentencing changes, you look at identity theft, and we lowered the presumptive Measure 57 from 24 months to 18. And instead of a decrease in sentence, we've actually had about half to 1 month increase in average sentence length for those crimes. So, it's one thing to lower sentences, but it really takes a system buy-in to make changes. It's you can't really just do that statutorily and expect to be immediately effective.
Madam Chair, I want to go back to the front end of the meeting and ask a question, and I hope it becomes obvious why I'm asking this, because I think it's relevant to what we're talking about right now. You said that the average length of stay in Oregon right now is a hair over 44 months. I think it's 44.1 or 2 or 3, something like that. How does that compare with the national average?
I'd have to get back to you on that. I know what you're talking.
Can you get us what the national average looks like, the overall national average, and by state, please, as compared to where Oregon is right now? And as to this idea that Representative Olson has about adding more transitional leave. I know that this may make your life more difficult and throw a wrench into the works, but if we're going to have this conversation about doing that, I think we need to look at this by crime and see how this impacts these crimes, because this is what we didn't do before. And I think, with due respect, Representative Olson, until you see on paper how it affects each one of those crimes by grid block, I think you might be a little bit surprised at what you're doing to the sentencing system in Oregon. And the one place that I'd like to caution us on going is there's 8 crimes that we applied additional transitional leave to that were violent crimes before. And CVU and some others advocated against that. And I certainly would want us to be very cautionary before we, through another 30, 60, or 90 days, when somebody commits a criminally negligent homicide that may have been pled down from a manslaughter 2, or a rape 3, or a rob 3, or a assault 3, or there's 8 of them. I'll get you the list. I'll be more than happy to provide you with that list. But let's be careful about this, and let's see how it affects these crimes individually and by grid block, so that we know exactly what we're walking into, as opposed to just waving the wand and say we're going to do an extra 30 or 60 or 90 days. The last comment I have is I was looking at Multnomah County's and the way they're doing the JRI, and a question that I have that I think is worth looking at is this: is that within that I notice that they're taking assault twos and rob twos, which are part of Measure 11, which are, I believe, were part of the original 3194 bill, because there's a lot of volume within those two crimes, and they're utilizing that to keep people out of prison, which, by the way, just for history standpoint and sake, the reason that that law is there today is because Crime Victims United worked very hard with law enforcement and defense attorneys and others a long time ago, when we came around the table and used to talk to each other and actually have conversations and try to get somewhere, to deliver a bill to the legislature that allowed for these blow-offs to second-degree crimes within Measure 11, that allowed judges to reduce sentence and, in cases, give probationary sentences. So I say that because I think that this is a good idea, and I think that I'd like to, if Multnomah County is doing that, I'd like to see what the other counties are doing along those lines, because if we've got people that are committing these crimes but are meeting the criteria to allow them to be on probation or greatly, negotiate their sentences down and maybe do local jail time or whatever, I think that we should take a good look at that. Okay?
I think Caroline Wong's in the room if she wanted to comment on Multnomah County, how they
Because I mean, I don't even pretend to know how the mechanics work in that. I know the basic of what's in the law, but I don't know how they're working the mechanics in Multnomah County to reach the goal. But if there's a way to, I know that you can't. Excuse me for going on here for a minute, but I know that you can't tell your fellow DAs what to do. But if we could get our minds and our different counties wrapped around whatever Multnomah, maybe there's a model there for doing this. I don't know.
Well, for us in Multnomah County, we had decided that we wanted to open up our JRI program to more than just property and drug offenses. We were taking person crimes because many of our person crimes were getting probation anyway. And we figured with JRI, at least if we put them in that program, then they could get access to services on supervision and have a more intensive supervision model in general. And so in terms of the rob to, assault to, some of them are 1049 eligible, so judges are able to depart. And sometimes through plea negotiations, depending on their risk and their needs and the victim impact and input, we would agree to give them an attempt, rob to, an attempt assault to bring them back down into probation, and we would place them very specifically on JRI supervision.
Mike, follow up with what Steve was saying of the 8 crimes he's identified that you mentioned earlier. I would be really interested in knowing what the recidivism rate on those are.
Yeah, and so that's one of the challenging things about short-term trans leave. Obviously, this program really started in January 1 almost of 2014, July 1 of 13, but that's really when we started to see the uptick. So to have a true recidivism rate, you need 3 years to see how they do. But that is something that we are working with the Department of Corrections on to see, hey, let's look at the first year. I mean, and we know a lot of times law enforcement realizes that if you're going to recidivate, a lot of times it happens pretty quickly, right? So we do have some results that we can look at as early returns. It wouldn't be definitive, but we are working with Department of Corrections to get those numbers and see how the program's working.
I can tell you, Madam Chair and Representative Olson, that based on it was 9 crimes that you submitted to me, Mr. Dole, a while back.
Yep.
9 crimes. And out of those 9 crimes, of the more than 1,000 individuals who were released to short-term trans leave over the last year, only 5 failed who were incarcerated for one of the crimes you listed below.
I think what's probably going to happen is, as we move forward with the legislative side of this conversation, is my colleagues are going to look to this group to say, how do we fix this? And so to the extent that we can get information from DOC and CJC around the trans leave conversation, around what Steve talked about, what Multnomah County is doing, and can that be replicated? And whether or not that's a conversation, I think that would happen within ODAA, I presume. I think there needs to be homework assignments to then come back to this group to see if there's a way to find the $9 million by doing things a little bit differently, as opposed to taking it out of the grants that by that time we will have already granted out. So that's, I'm wondering if there's anything else in the audience especially that we might not be thinking of that we could assign out to folks to get more data, where there may be savings that we're not thinking about or know about, where it can be brought back to this group and we can make a recommendation to the legislature before February, before we make funding decisions, but after our counties have been told that they're getting this money.
Madam Chair, one of the conversations that we've...
Madam Chair?
Yes, Scott?
I'm sorry.
No, go for it.
As you're having people, I can't see other hands. As you're asking people to think about ways you might change systems or find $9 million, could we also ask for a review of when we had the limitation on technical revocations? I think that affected the funding, and it's sunsetting. So, as you're looking at all options, that might be worth considering.
And who has that information? Technical revocations? Is that data you all have?
CJC.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can,
Okay. Thanks, Scott.
Is that for local control offenders?
I was half talking.
I distracted him, Sheriff, I'm sorry.
So, if Kelly says that we can figure it out, then I bet you we can, but
Hey, Scott, is that for local control offenders? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it was, well, it was the overall population, and it was technical revocations could not be held for more than 90 days.
oh, I remember.
And it,
Senate
yeah,
Bill
it
395,
adjusts
I
the
think, is
population count, and that's where the funding comes.
750
So
or something like that.
it may be a bad idea because it would affect the 1145, but it also means a different jail population. We can go back in history and look at it if it has any merit
Okay.
to consider.
Madam Chair, I was just going to say, I like this notion of us as a system really thinking about what programs are out there, what can we implement, what should we be looking at from one county and stealing for another county. And I think as we talked offline about the coming together on November 10th and having the governor come and kick off that event, I think the vision really is having all 36 counties in the room. I know the last time we did this, we called it the Justice Reinvestment Summit. We're really envisioning a very positive coming together of all 36 counties, having local legislators attend for the meeting. I know you were only able to come, a few of you were able to come in for the lunch and come out again. But I think having us come together as a group to really look at what's working, what do the outcome measures look like, and how can we spread the good news across the entire state. I think that would be a really powerful venue, especially if this task force was willing to host that or support that event in concert with the governor.
Yes, Steve.
Madam Chair, Colette, are all the people that you're going to move at Deer Ridge, are you moving some people into Deer Ridge, or are those people just being moved from the minimum to the medium, and you're making the medium into a minimum? Is that the way I understand it in simple terms?
In simple terms, Mr. Dole, Madam Chair, that's correct, but then it does give me, it would give us 200 additional beds.
No, I understand
and then
that.
those individuals would come from elsewhere.
Yeah, I know, I understand that part of it. I guess what I'm driving at here is this, is that I was just doing a little math. Do you have a breakdown on this move? Because it occurs to me that we're doing a move inside a facility that is costing almost $12,000 per inmate to move them. And I don't know how far you're moving them, whether you're moving them 100 feet or 500 feet or how far you're moving them, but that's an expensive move that you're doing there.
Mr. Dole, Madam Chair, it wasn't intended to be an expensive move. So let me break down the cost for you. So the cost of the shift will be, of just the shift alone, will be $2.5 million. So 500,000 of that, we want to begin soon with facilities and operations. That's simply adding equipment, making sure the infrastructure is working, et cetera, for a facility that's been sitting since 2007. Then $2 million will come from adding 6 security positions, and the remaining startup depending on how the numbers look in mid-November, the actual population numbers. So I want to be really clear that the additional beds come at that price. The $2.5 million is only to accommodate the shift. Any additional beds would require additional staffing for programming, security, counseling, and medical.
Can I get a copy of this total cost?
Certainly.
How it lays out, if you could send that, please.
Who's the convener of the November 10th summit?
So I think the idea is, immediately once we saw the October 1 forecast coming out, we spoke with the governor's office, and she dedicated time on her calendar on November 10th to make that happen. But in an ideal world, it's this task force in conjunction with the governor's office.
Well, representing AOC here, I will do whatever I can to get the 36 counties there.
Great, thank you.
And I do think it's an appropriate role for us to play as a task force.
Great.
Good.
Anything else?
Does the task force have any bills that you guys get to use during legislative sessions? I've never seen any of them about that.
Rules can do anything, can't they?
That's what somebody told me once. This body does not have any bill drafting authority.
We have a deadline on the 24th.
Yep. So,
Madam Chair, just for clarification, knowing we're on a short time schedule here, but I know several of our associations meet on a regular basis. I'm assuming that this dialogue is expected to continue so we can go back to our communities, speak with our associations, come up with ideas, and we can continue to pass those on through the Criminal Justice Commission.
that was actually going to be my next ask, is that for folks who represent stakeholder groups here, I would ask the same thing, which is to go talk to your association, share with them what we learned today, and see what part of the conversation is appropriate for your association, and how you can be helpful, especially in counties where there may be work to be done. And it looks like from my list that the CJC is going to look at trans leave, Representative Olson's grid question, technical revocation. Am I missing any? Am I missing any assignments that we gave you guys?
Short-term trans leave, recidivism,
Right,
success.
the recidivism. All right.
Specifically based on those 9 crimes, which I forwarded to you.
Yeah.
And then Colette, you have a couple of information requests from Mr. Dole. So if you could share that
We'll
with
manage
everyone,
those.
that would be great.
And then last but not least, sponsoring the November 10th.
Yes, we will sponsor that with you all.
And Madam Chair, as we hear back from OACCD and ODAA and all of our other partners who are going to go back to their organizations and talk these things through and then give ideas to us, the CJC, would it be appropriate to either try to get this group back together before then, or maybe some sort of subcommittee of this group to look at the agenda and help give us input as to that?
For the summit?
For the November 10th
Yeah, I think either trying to get us all on a call or a handful of us as a subcommittee together if you need us, if you need our bodies present. Otherwise, maybe we can schedule a call to go through what's on the agenda and what our role is, and what expectations you would have from the members of this committee.
Great.
Is there anyone else, since we're not at a round discussion table, who has anything to say, wants to add to the conversation? Chris Hoy, you're all the way in the back.
I do have one
Yeah.
thing I would like to mention, and we discussed this a little bit at our Stern Committee meeting for our Justice Reinvestment Program. And we were concerned in Multnomah County when we saw that our prison intakes were down, that our second sentence revocations were steady, but our length of stay numbers were up. And I know we had some commentary about length of stay and why that might be. And part of it really could be because we're seeing more level 9 and 10 drug offenses. But I would just like to point out that the more we, and I think Ross had pointed this out, take the low-hanging fruit and place them on probation, the more cases that really should be in prison are going to be staying there, and therefore that higher number of length of stay is, going to be an accurate portrayal of who's left. And so I don't want it being shown that we're showing a higher length of stay, and therefore we're not doing a good job of lengthening those prison terms, when in actuality I think we are. It's just that's the end result of the average.
Well, and I think we recognize that, that's at least that's the way the data plays out, and that's why. All right. So if there's nothing else, then I will adjourn the meeting, and we will wait for communications from you, Mike, about whether we get together in a subcommittee or by phone.
Yep.
All right. With that, we're adjourned.
Thanks, everyone.
We are still being recorded, so just know that.